Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern ambition, a battle for influence was brewing that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. What the public saw were carefully orchestrated appearances, warm smiles, and coordinated charity events. What they didn't see was a calculated campaign by Queen Camilla to reshape the royal hierarchy in her favor, a move so bold it would ultimately backfire in spectacular fashion. For years, Camilla had played the patient game. From the shadows of scandal to the throne room itself, she had climbed every rung of royal society with determination that impressed even her harshest critics. But patience, it seemed, had its limits. With King Charles's health concerns mounting and public scrutiny intensifying, Camilla saw an opportunity to secure not just her position, but her legacy. What she didn't anticipate was that her husband, the king himself, would become her greatest obstacle. This is the story of how one woman's quest for ultimate royal authority led to the most dramatic internal conflict the monarchy has faced in decades. It's a tale of ambition meeting tradition, of marriage tested by power, and of an institution forced to confront its own future. The consequences would ripple far beyond palace walls, challenging everything the British public thought they knew about their modern royal family. When the dust settled, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Clarence House as Queen Camilla stood at her private study window, watching the carefully choreographed dance of royal protocol unfold below. Gardeners moved with precision across the lawns, security personnel maintained their invisible presence, and staff members hurried between buildings with the urgency that had become commonplace since Charles's coronation. But Camilla's mind wasn't on the daily operations that kept the monarchy functioning. Her thoughts were occupied by something far more significant, a plan that had been taking shape in her mind for months. At 76 years old, Camilla understood better than most that time was a luxury the royal family couldn't take for granted. Charles's recent health scares had served as stark reminders of mortality, and with them came an uncomfortable reality. The succession plans that had been theoretical for so long were now very much practical considerations. While William was the obvious heir, the transition period between monarchs had always been delicate territory, filled with opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Camilla had spent decades mastering the art of royal positioning. From her early days as the woman blamed for disrupting Charles and Diana's marriage, she had transformed herself into a respected consort, working tirelessly to win over both the public and the establishment. Her charity work had been exemplary, her public appearances graceful, and her support of Charles unwavering. But respect and influence were different currencies entirely, and Camilla had begun to realize that her current position, while secure, lacked the kind of lasting power that could shape the monarchy's future direction. The idea had first emerged during a private conversation with Lady Sarah Keswick, one of her most trusted confidants, and a woman whose family had served the royal household for generations. They had been discussing the upcoming state visit from the Canadian Prime Minister when Sarah made an offhand comment about the changing dynamics within the Commonwealth realms. Several nations had been questioning the relevance of the monarchy in modern times, and there were whispers about potential constitutional changes that could affect the royal family's international role. That conversation had planted a seed in Camilla's mind. If the monarchy was facing external pressures to modernize and adapt, perhaps it was time for internal changes as well. The traditional power structure, with its emphasis on birthright and historical precedent, might benefit from a more merit-based approach to influence and decision-making. And who better to champion such changes than someone who had already broken convention by becoming queen despite the odds? Over the following weeks, Camilla began quietly reaching out to various contacts within the royal household, testing the waters for her emerging vision. She spoke with private secretaries about modernization initiatives, discussed constitutional matters with legal advisors, and even broached the subject of expanded royal roles with select members of parliament. The responses were mixed but encouraging enough to convince her that there was appetite for change, provided it was presented correctly. Her first concrete step came during a routine meeting with the Privy Council, where constitutional matters affecting the crown were discussed. Traditionally, these meetings were formal affairs where the queen consort's role was largely ceremonial, but Camilla had begun preparing more thoroughly for each session, arriving with detailed notes and thoughtful questions that demonstrated her deep understanding of the issues at hand. Her contributions didn't go unnoticed, and several council members privately expressed appreciation for her engagement. Encouraged by this reception, Camilla began expanding her involvement in other areas typically reserved for the monarch or direct heirs. She requested briefings on Commonwealth affairs, inserted herself into discussions about the royal family's environmental initiatives, and even began meeting independently with foreign dignitaries during state visits. Each move was subtle but deliberate, designed to establish her presence in spheres of influence that had previously been outside her purview. The strategy wasn't without its challenges. Traditional courtiers, particularly those who had served during Elizabeth II's reign, viewed these developments with suspicion. They had witnessed decades of carefully maintained protocols and weren't enthusiastic about changes that seemed to blur established lines of authority. Some began voicing concerns to Charles, suggesting that Camilla's expanded activities might be creating confusion about roles and responsibilities within the royal hierarchy. Charles's initial response to these concerns was diplomatic but telling. He valued Camilla's input and appreciated her dedication to royal duties, but he also recognized the importance of maintaining constitutional clarity. The monarchy's strength had always rested on clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and any perceived ambiguity could create problems both domestically and internationally. When he gently suggested that Camilla might want to focus her energies on her established charitable interests, her reaction was more intense than he had anticipated. The conversation took place in Charles's private office at Buckingham Palace on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. Camilla had arrived expecting to discuss upcoming Christmas arrangements for the royal family, but instead found herself facing what felt like a diplomatic intervention. Charles spoke carefully about the importance of tradition and the need for the royal family to present a unified front during challenging times. He acknowledged her contributions, but emphasized that expanding beyond established boundaries could create unintended consequences. Camilla listened with growing frustration. After years of proving herself worthy of the Queen title, she was being told to step back just as she felt ready to step forward. The irony wasn't lost on her that the institution she had worked so hard to join was now limiting her ability to truly influence its direction. When Charles finished speaking, the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions that had been building for months. Her response was measured but firm. She reminded Charles of her decades of service, her successful transformation of public opinion, and her unique perspective as someone who had entered the royal family from the outside. She argued that her expanded involvement wasn't about personal ambition, but about bringing fresh thinking to an institution that needed to evolve to survive. The monarchy's future depended on its ability to adapt to changing times, and who better to help guide that adaptation than someone who had already successfully navigated major change? The discussion continued for over an hour, with both sides presenting their cases with the careful politeness that characterized royal disagreements. Charles maintained his position about the importance of constitutional clarity, while Camilla pressed her case for a more dynamic approach to royal roles. Neither was entirely satisfied with the outcome, which was a carefully worded agreement to continue exploring ways for Camilla to contribute meaningfully while respecting established protocols. But, for Camilla, the conversation had been a wake-up call. She realized that gentle persuasion and gradual expansion of influence weren't going to achieve the kind of lasting change she envisioned. If she wanted to secure a meaningful legacy and position the monarchy for long-term success, she would need to be more strategic and decisive in her approach. The days of patient waiting and careful positioning were over. That night, as she reviewed her notes from recent meetings and correspondence, Camilla began formulating a more ambitious plan. If traditional channels weren't going to accommodate her vision for expanded influence, perhaps it was time to create new channels entirely. The monarchy had survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances, and she was convinced that her perspective and experience could be crucial assets in navigating the challenges ahead. The first phase of her new strategy involved building a stronger support network within the establishment. Rather than working within existing structures, she would focus on cultivating relationships with key figures who shared her vision for modernization. This meant reaching out to progressive members of parliament, influential media figures, and international contacts who could help amplify her message about the need for evolutionary change within the monarchy. Her second priority was documenting and publicizing her contributions to royal duties in ways that would make her expanded role seem natural and necessary. This involved working with her communications team to ensure that her charitable work, public appearances, and private meetings received appropriate coverage and commentary. The goal wasn't self-promotion but rather establishing a clear record of her capabilities and achievements that would support future arguments about expanded responsibilities. The third element of her strategy was perhaps the most delicate, gradually implementing changes in her daily routine and responsibilities that would create new precedents for queen consorts. These changes would be subtle enough to avoid immediate confrontation, but significant enough to establish new expectations about the role's potential scope. Over time, these precedents could become the foundation for more formal expansions of authority and influence. As autumn turned to winter, Camilla began implementing these strategies with the same methodical approach that had characterized her earlier transformation from royal mistress to respected queen. Each move was calculated, each conversation purposeful, and each public appearance designed to reinforce her vision of an evolved and expanded role for the queen consort. What she didn't fully anticipate was how closely Charles was monitoring these developments, or how seriously he was taking the concerns being raised by traditional courtiers and constitutional experts. While Camilla saw her activities as natural evolution, others were beginning to view them as a systematic challenge to established authority. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just their marriage, but the very foundations of modern royal governance. The first signs of organized resistance to Camilla's expanding influence emerged in the most traditional corner of the royal establishment, the private secretary's offices. These career civil servants, who had devoted their professional lives to maintaining the delicate balance of constitutional monarchy, began exchanging concerned conversations about what they perceived as a gradual erosion of established protocols. Their worry wasn't personal animosity toward Camilla, but rather a deep-seated belief that the monarchy's stability depended on clear, unchanging structures that had been refined over centuries. Sir Edward Harrington, Charles's principal private secretary, and a man whose family had served the crown for 3 generations, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His role required him to facilitate the king's work while maintaining the constitutional boundaries that kept the monarchy functioning smoothly. Camilla's recent activities had begun creating complications that went beyond simple scheduling conflicts. Foreign dignitaries were expressing confusion about who spoke authoritatively for the crown. Commonwealth representatives were uncertain about proper protocols for engaging with the royal family, and Parliament was beginning to ask questions about the constitutional implications of expanded queen consort activities. The situation came to a head during preparations for a crucial state visit from the Australian Prime Minister. Australia had been experiencing renewed Republican sentiment, with polls showing increased support for removing the monarchy from their constitutional structure. The visit was intended to strengthen ties and demonstrate the continued relevance of the Commonwealth relationship, but Camilla's insistence on participating in previously monarch-only discussions about constitutional matters had created diplomatic complications. The Australian High Commissioner had privately reached out to Sir Edward expressing confusion about the appropriate level of engagement with Queen Camilla during policy discussions. Traditionally, such conversations would involve only the monarch and relevant officials, but Camilla had requested inclusion in meetings that would normally be outside the Queen Consort's purview. The Australians weren't certain whether this represented a formal evolution in royal protocol or simply Camilla's personal preference, and they needed clarity to properly prepare their prime minister for the visit. Sir Edward faced a delicate challenge. He could address the immediate diplomatic concerns by clarifying current protocols, but doing so would inevitably create friction with Camilla, who had made clear her expectations about expanded participation in such events. Alternatively, he could accommodate her requests while potentially creating precedents that might complicate future constitutional arrangements. Neither option was ideal, and both carried risks for the institution he was sworn to protect. His decision to seek guidance from Charles proved to be a turning point in the developing crisis. During a private meeting in the King's study, Sir Edward presented a comprehensive overview of the mounting concerns about role clarity within the royal family. He had prepared detailed documentation showing how Camilla's expanded activities were creating confusion among government officials, diplomatic representatives, and even within the royal household itself. The evidence was more extensive than Charles had realized. Beyond the Australian situation, there were similar complications emerging in Canada, New Zealand, and several other Commonwealth realms. The British Foreign Office had begun receiving informal inquiries about the constitutional status of Queen Camilla's expanded role, and legal experts within the government were questioning whether current arrangements adequately addressed the implications of her increased involvement in state matters. Charles listened with growing concern as Sir Edward outlined the potential consequences of allowing the situation to continue without clear resolution. Constitutional monarchy depended on precisely defined roles and responsibilities, and any ambiguity about who held what authority could create serious problems during times of crisis. The monarchy's legitimacy rested on its adherence to established law and tradition, and even well-intentioned departures from established norms could undermine that foundation. The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visit from Prince William, who had requested an urgent meeting about what he described as concerning developments within the royal family's public activities. William's perspective on the situation was shaped by his unique position as heir apparent and his growing awareness of the challenges he would eventually inherit. His concerns weren't primarily about Camilla's personal ambitions, but rather about the potential long-term consequences for the monarchy's constitutional position. William had been receiving his own reports from royal protection officers, parliamentary liaisons, and international contacts about confusion surrounding royal protocols. As future king, he understood that any precedents established during his father's reign would likely continue into his own, potentially creating permanent changes to the monarchy's structure and function. His visit to Charles wasn't intended as criticism of Camilla, but rather as an expression of serious concern about institutional stability. The three men spent the next 2 hours reviewing documentation and discussing the broader implications of the current situation. William shared intelligence from his own network of contacts, including feedback from young Commonwealth leaders who were questioning whether the British royal family truly understood modern democratic governance. Several had expressed surprise at what appeared to be an expansion of unelected authority within the monarchy, raising questions about accountability and constitutional appropriateness. Charles found himself facing a crisis that went far beyond simple marital disagreement. The concerns being raised by his most trusted advisors and his heir weren't about personal relationships or family dynamics, but rather about the fundamental integrity of the constitutional system he had sworn to uphold. His coronation oath had committed him to governing according to established law and custom, and allowing significant departures from traditional royal protocols could be seen as a violation of that sacred commitment. The situation became even more complicated when Archbishop of Canterbury requested a private meeting about related concerns from the ecclesiastical perspective. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, Charles held a role that carried specific constitutional and spiritual responsibilities. The Archbishop had been receiving inquiries from other Anglican leaders about the theological implications of expanded royal authority, particularly regarding the relationship between divine appointment and democratic accountability that underpinned the monarchy's spiritual legitimacy. These conversations forced Charles to confront uncomfortable questions about the balance between supporting his wife's ambitions and protecting the institution they both served. Camilla's contributions to royal duties had been substantial and valuable, but the growing evidence suggested that her expanded role was creating problems that extended far beyond their household. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining public confidence in its constitutional appropriateness, and that confidence was beginning to show signs of strain. Meanwhile, Camilla was pursuing her own strategy of building support for her expanded role. She had begun cultivating relationships with progressive political figures who supported modernization of traditional institutions. Her conversations with Labour MPs, Liberal Democrat leaders, and even some conservative modernizers had convinced her that there was significant political appetite for evolutionary change within the monarchy. These politicians saw her expanded activities as evidence of the royal family's willingness to adapt to contemporary expectations about transparency and engagement. Her media strategy was equally sophisticated. Through carefully orchestrated briefings with sympathetic journalists, she had begun shaping public discourse about the potential benefits of a more active queen consort. Articles began appearing in major newspapers discussing the historical precedents for influential royal consorts and the potential advantages of having a more engaged and visible queen. The coverage was generally positive, portraying her expanded role as a natural evolution rather than a departure from tradition. The public relations campaign extended to her charitable work, where she began highlighting projects that demonstrated her policy expertise and leadership capabilities. Her involvement with literacy programs was expanded to include educational policy discussions. Her environmental work began incorporating broader sustainability initiatives, and her support for domestic violence causes evolved into advocacy for legal and social reforms. Each expansion was presented as a natural extension of her existing commitments, making criticism seem churlish and regressive. These efforts were beginning to show results in public opinion polling. Surveys conducted by reputable research firms showed growing approval for Queen Camilla's expanded public role, with majorities expressing support for royal family members who demonstrated expertise and engagement beyond ceremonial functions. The polling data provided ammunition for supporters of her strategy and created political pressure for traditionalists who opposed change. However, the same polling revealed more complex underlying attitudes toward royal authority and constitutional change. While respondents supported active engagement by royal family members, they also expressed strong preferences for clear accountability and democratic oversight of expanded royal influence. The public appeared willing to accept evolutionary change within the monarchy, but only within carefully defined boundaries that preserved democratic governance. These nuances in public opinion became crucial as political leaders began taking more definitive positions on the developing situation. Conservative traditionalists rallied around the importance of constitutional continuity, while progressive modernizers embraced the potential for positive change. The debate was no longer confined to palace corridors, but was becoming a broader national conversation about the role of monarchy in contemporary British society. The situation reached a critical juncture when several senior Conservative MPs requested a meeting with Charles to discuss their concerns about constitutional implications of recent developments. These weren't fringe politicians or known Republicans, but respected parliamentary figures who had long supported the monarchy and understood its constitutional significance. Their decision to formally raise concerns represented a serious escalation in the political dimensions of the crisis. Charles realized that what had begun as a family disagreement about roles and responsibilities had evolved into a potential constitutional crisis with far-reaching implications for the monarchy's future. The pressure was mounting from multiple directions. Constitutional experts worried about precedent, diplomatic representatives needed clarity about protocols, political leaders demanded accountability, and public opinion remained divided about the appropriate balance between tradition and modernization. As winter deepened and the Australian state visit approached, Charles knew that decisive action would soon become unavoidable. The question was no longer whether to address Camilla's expanding role, but how to do so in a way that preserved both their marriage and the constitutional integrity of the monarchy. The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of his decision would likely resonate for generations to come. The confrontation that would define the remainder of Charles's reign began not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a carefully worded memorandum delivered to Camilla's private secretary on a gray February morning. The document, bearing the official seal of the King's office, outlined new protocols for Queen Consort participation in state functions and constitutional matters. Its language was diplomatic and respectful, but its implications were unmistakable. Camilla's expanded role was being formally curtailed. The memorandum detailed specific limitations on Queen Consort involvement in Commonwealth affairs, diplomatic negotiations, and constitutional discussions. It clarified that while her charitable work and ceremonial duties would continue unchanged, her participation in policy-related meetings and state decision-making processes would return to traditional boundaries. The document emphasized that these clarifications were necessary to maintain constitutional clarity and ensure proper accountability in royal governance. Camilla read the memorandum 3 times before its full implications became clear. This wasn't a gentle suggestion or a request for discussion. It was a direct order from the king, delivered through official channels with the formality reserved for serious constitutional matters. The message was unmistakable. Charles had chosen institutional stability over his wife's ambitions, and he was prepared to use the full authority of his position to enforce that decision. Her initial response was a mixture of shock and anger that she struggled to contain during her morning appointments. She had anticipated resistance to her expanded activities, but she hadn't expected Charles to respond with such formal and public authority. The use of official channels rather than private conversation felt like a betrayal of their partnership and a rejection of everything she had contributed to the royal family's success over the past decades. The timing of the memorandum was particularly significant, arriving just days before the Australian state visit that had become a focal point for concerns about royal protocol confusion. Camilla realized that Charles had deliberately chosen to resolve the situation before the visit, using the diplomatic pressure as justification for decisive action. The Australian Prime Minister's arrival would now proceed according to traditional protocols, with Camilla's role clearly defined and limited to ceremonial functions. Rather than accepting the constraints quietly, Camilla decided to respond with a strategy that would force Charles to confront the broader implications of his decision. She requested a formal meeting with the king, using the same official channels he had employed to deliver the memorandum. This wasn't going to be a private marital discussion, but a constitutional conversation between the monarch and his queen consort about the future direction of the royal family. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday in the throne room at Buckingham Palace, an unusual venue that underscored the formal nature of their discussion. Camilla arrived with her own prepared documentation, including public opinion surveys showing support for her expanded role, correspondence from Commonwealth leaders expressing appreciation for her engagement, and legal opinions about the constitutional flexibility available to modern monarchies. Charles began the meeting by reaffirming his respect for Camilla's contributions and his personal appreciation for her dedication to royal duties. However, he emphasized that his primary responsibility was to protect the constitutional integrity of the monarchy, even when that required making difficult decisions about family members' roles. The recent concerns raised by diplomatic representatives, parliamentary leaders, and constitutional experts had convinced him that immediate clarification was necessary to prevent more serious complications. Camilla's response was measured but forceful. She challenged the assumption that her expanded activities created constitutional problems, arguing instead that they demonstrated the monarchy's ability to evolve and adapt to contemporary expectations. She presented evidence of positive public reception for her initiatives and questioned whether the concerns being raised were based on genuine constitutional issues or simply resistance to change from traditional establishment figures. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with both participants presenting detailed arguments supported by legal precedents, historical examples, and contemporary political analysis. Charles maintained that constitutional monarchy required clear boundaries and predictable protocols, while Camilla argued that rigid adherence to tradition could make the monarchy irrelevant in a changing world. Neither was willing to compromise on fundamental principles, creating an impasse that formal discussion couldn't resolve. The breaking point came when Camilla presented what she called her final proposal, a structured plan for gradually expanding queen consort responsibilities through careful negotiation with Parliament, Commonwealth representatives, and constitutional experts. The plan included safeguards for democratic accountability, clear boundaries for expanded authority, and mechanisms for public input on royal role evolution. It was a sophisticated document that demonstrated her serious commitment to institutional change rather than personal aggrandizement. Charles reviewed the proposal carefully before delivering his definitive response. While he acknowledged the thoughtfulness of her approach and the potential benefits of some suggested changes, he couldn't support a plan that would fundamentally alter the constitutional balance between monarchy and democracy. The risks of unintended consequences were too significant, and the potential for creating precedents that future monarchs might struggle to manage was too high. The rejection of her carefully crafted proposal marked the end of Camilla's hopes for gradual, negotiated expansion of her role. Charles had made clear that he wasn't simply resisting change for traditional reasons. He was actively choosing to prevent constitutional evolution that might strengthen the monarchy's long-term prospects. From Camilla's perspective, this represented a failure of leadership and vision that could have serious consequences for the royal family's future relevance. Her response to this final rejection was swift and decisive. Rather than accepting defeat quietly, Camilla announced her intention to take her case directly to the British people through a series of public speeches and media appearances. If Charles wouldn't support institutional modernization through private negotiation, she would build public pressure for change through democratic engagement. The monarchy served the people, and ultimately the people should have a voice in determining how their royal family evolved to meet contemporary needs. This announcement transformed what had been an internal royal family disagreement into a public constitutional crisis. Camilla's decision to appeal directly to popular opinion challenged fundamental assumptions about royal family unity and the private nature of institutional decision-making. Constitutional experts were divided about whether a queen consort had the right to publicly disagree with the monarch on matters of royal governance, creating uncertainty about the legal and practical implications of her strategy. The media response was immediate and intense. Newspapers aligned with different political perspectives took predictably opposing positions, with traditional publications supporting Charles's emphasis on constitutional stability and progressive outlets endorsing Camilla's call for modernization. The coverage quickly expanded beyond simple reporting to include detailed analysis of constitutional law, historical precedents for royal family disagreements, and speculation about potential long-term consequences. Public opinion polling conducted during the immediate aftermath of Camilla's announcement showed the British people were genuinely divided about the fundamental questions at stake. While majorities supported both Charles and Camilla personally, there was no clear consensus about whether the monarchy should embrace significant change or maintain traditional structures. The division roughly corresponded to broader political alignments, with conservative voters supporting stability and progressive voters endorsing evolution. The situation became even more complicated when several senior political figures began taking public positions on the dispute. The Prime Minister attempted to maintain neutrality while emphasizing the government's commitment to constitutional monarchy, but backbench MPs from both major parties began expressing strong opinions about the appropriate balance between tradition and modernization. Parliamentary debates about royal family matters were rare, but the constitutional implications of the current crisis seemed to demand legislative attention. International reactions were equally varied. Commonwealth realm governments expressed general support for whatever resolution the British royal family reached, but privately many were concerned about the potential for constitutional uncertainty to affect their own relationships with the monarchy. Republican movements in several nations seized on the crisis as evidence that monarchical systems were inherently unstable and undemocratic, while monarchist organizations rallied to support traditional royal structures. The Australian state visit proceeded as scheduled, but it was inevitably overshadowed by the ongoing constitutional crisis. Prime Minister's meetings with Charles followed traditional protocols, but Camilla's reduced participation was noted by diplomatic observers and interpreted as evidence of serious internal tensions within the royal family. The visit's intended purpose of strengthening Commonwealth relationships was partially undermined by questions about the stability and coherence of royal family governance. Behind the public drama, both Charles and Camilla were grappling with the personal implications of their constitutional disagreement. Their marriage had survived previous challenges, including intense public scrutiny and family difficulties, but this crisis struck at the core of their shared commitment to royal service. They were discovering that their visions for the monarchy's future were fundamentally incompatible, creating tensions that couldn't be resolved through compromise or accommodation. Charles found himself facing criticism from unexpected quarters. Progressive commentators who had previously supported his environmental activism and modernizing instincts now questioned his willingness to embrace necessary change. Some suggested that his rejection of Camilla's proposals demonstrated a failure to understand contemporary expectations about leadership and accountability in democratic societies. The criticism was particularly difficult because it came from people who shared his values but disagreed with his judgment. Meanwhile, Camilla was experiencing the isolation that came with challenging the monarchy from within. Traditional royal supporters viewed her public campaign as inappropriate and potentially damaging to institutional stability, while constitutional experts debated whether her actions violated informal constraints on royal family behavior. She was discovering that taking her case to the public carried costs that private negotiation might have avoided. As February turned to March, both sides began preparing for what appeared to be a prolonged struggle over the future direction of the British monarchy. Neither Charles nor Camilla was prepared to back down from their fundamental positions, and the constitutional crisis showed no signs of natural resolution. The royal family faced its greatest internal challenge in generations, with consequences that would inevitably extend far beyond their personal relationships to affect the monarchy's role in British society for years to come. What began as Camilla's personal campaign for expanded royal authority quickly evolved into something far more significant: a genuine rebellion against traditional monarchy that drew support from unexpected quarters throughout British society. Her decision to take her case directly to the public had unleashed forces that neither she nor Charles had fully anticipated, creating a constitutional crisis that threatened to permanently alter the relationship between the royal family and the democratic institutions they served. The first major breakthrough came when Lady Sarah Morrison, a respected constitutional lawyer and life peer in the House of Lords, announced her support for Camilla's modernization proposals. Lady Morrison had spent decades defending traditional monarchy against Republican challenges, but she argued that Camilla's vision represented necessary evolution rather than dangerous revolution. Her endorsement carried particular weight because it came from someone with impeccable establishment credentials who couldn't be dismissed as a radical or opportunist. Lady Morrison's intervention opened the floodgates for other establishment figures to express previously private reservations about the monarchy's resistance to change. Sir Michael Davidson, former cabinet secretary and one of the most respected civil servants of his generation, published an article in the Times arguing that constitutional monarchy needed periodic updating to remain relevant in democratic society. He stopped short of endorsing Camilla's specific proposals, but his call for thoughtful constitutional evolution was widely interpreted as support for her general approach. The intellectual momentum behind Camilla's campaign was further strengthened when several prominent historians published a joint letter calling for serious consideration of royal role modernization. These weren't Republican activists or political radicals, but serious academics who had spent their careers studying constitutional development and understood the historical precedents for significant royal evolution. Their letter emphasized that successful monarchies had always adapted to changing circumstances, and that current rigid adherence to 20th century protocols might actually represent a departure from historical norms of flexibility. More surprising was the support that emerged from younger members of the Conservative Party, who saw Camilla's modernization agenda as consistent with their own efforts to refresh traditional institutions for contemporary relevance. Several rising conservative MPs argued that the monarchy's long-term survival depended on demonstrating its ability to evolve with democratic expectations, and that Camilla's proposals offered a constructive path forward. Their support created significant pressure within conservative ranks, forcing party leadership to reconsider their automatic support for traditional royal protocols. The rebellion gained additional momentum when it became clear that significant elements within the Church of England supported Camilla's vision of expanded queen consort authority. Several bishops argued that royal family modernization could strengthen rather than weaken the spiritual foundation of monarchy by demonstrating commitment to service and accountability values that resonated with contemporary Christian social teaching. The Archbishop of York's carefully worded statement about prayerful consideration of institutional evolution was interpreted as qualified support for Camilla's position. International support proved equally important in legitimizing the rebellion against traditional constraints. The Swedish royal family, widely admired for successfully modernizing while maintaining constitutional stability, privately expressed sympathy for Camilla's efforts to expand the queen consort role. Similar support emerged from constitutional monarchies in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, where royal families had successfully negotiated expanded authority for non-heir family members without creating democratic deficits. These international endorsements carried particular weight because they demonstrated practical precedents for the kind of changes Camilla was proposing. Constitutional experts pointed to successful examples of royal role evolution in other European monarchies as evidence that Britain's resistance to change might actually represent institutional conservatism rather than constitutional wisdom. The comparison was particularly powerful because these other monarchies had achieved greater popular support and democratic legitimacy through modernization rather than rigid traditionalism. The rebellion's growing strength was reflected in increasingly sophisticated public opinion polling that showed complex, but generally supportive attitudes toward constitutional change. While British voters remained divided on specific proposals, clear majorities supported the general principle that royal family roles should be able to evolve to meet contemporary needs. More significantly, younger voters showed strong support for expanded royal accountability and transparency, suggesting that resistance to change might create long-term legitimacy problems for the monarchy. Media coverage of the rebellion evolved from simple reporting of royal family disagreement to serious analysis of fundamental questions about democracy, accountability, and constitutional development. Major newspapers began publishing detailed investigations into the legal and practical implications of various modernization proposals, while television programs featured debates between constitutional experts representing different perspectives on royal evolution. The quality of public discourse about monarchy had reached levels not seen since the constitutional crises of earlier centuries. The rebellion's influence extended beyond traditional media to social platforms where younger Britons were engaging with questions about royal relevance and democratic governance. Hashtags supporting Camilla's modernization agenda trended regularly, while online discussions about constitutional monarchy became more sophisticated and informed. This digital engagement was particularly significant because it demonstrated that royal family modernization could actually increase rather than decrease public interest in monarchy among demographics that had previously been disengaged. Charles found himself facing opposition that went far beyond his wife's personal ambitions to include serious constitutional arguments from respected establishment figures. The rebellion wasn't simply about Camilla's role, but about fundamental questions regarding the monarchy's ability to adapt to democratic evolution without losing its essential character. He was being forced to defend traditional approaches that increasingly appeared inflexible rather than stable, conservative rather than wise. The pressure intensified when several Commonwealth realm governments began questioning whether British royal family internal conflicts affected their own constitutional arrangements. The Canadian Prime Minister's office issued a carefully neutral statement emphasizing their commitment to constitutional monarchy while noting their interest in observing developments in royal governance. Similar statements from Australia and New Zealand suggested that the rebellion's implications extended far beyond British domestic politics. Parliamentary pressure reached new levels when a cross-party group of MPs requested a formal briefing on the constitutional implications of the royal family dispute. While Parliament had traditionally maintained respectful distance from internal royal matters, the public nature of the current crisis and its potential impact on constitutional governance created legitimate grounds for legislative interest. The Speaker of the House confirmed that such a briefing would be appropriate, marking an unprecedented level of parliamentary engagement with royal family governance. The briefing session, held in closed committee to maintain appropriate constitutional protocol, revealed the depth of concern among elected representatives about the current situation. MPs from all major parties expressed worry that the royal family's inability to resolve internal disagreements about authority and responsibility could create broader problems for constitutional stability. Several suggested that formal parliamentary guidance might be necessary if the crisis couldn't be resolved through traditional royal family processes. Behind the scenes, both Charles and Camilla were struggling with the personal costs of their constitutional disagreement. Their marriage was under enormous strain as private conversations became increasingly difficult amid the public pressure surrounding their dispute. Staff members reported that the normally warm atmosphere in royal residences had become formal and tense, with both sides careful to avoid any appearance of compromise that might be interpreted as weakness. The situation was particularly difficult for other royal family members, who found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties and constitutional obligations. Prince William's position was especially delicate, as heir apparent who needed to maintain relationships with both his father and stepmother while avoiding any appearance of taking sides in a dispute that would affect his own future reign. His decision to maintain public neutrality while privately supporting constitutional stability was interpreted by both sides as evidence of their position's legitimacy. Princess Anne's response was characteristically direct. In a rare public statement, she emphasized the importance of royal family unity while noting her personal support for evolutionary change when it served the public interest. Her words were carefully chosen to avoid taking sides, but her emphasis on service over personal ambition was widely interpreted as mild criticism of the rebellion's focus on individual authority rather than collective responsibility. The rebellion reached its peak when Camilla announced a series of public lectures on constitutional monarchy and democratic accountability. These weren't political speeches, but academic presentations delivered at prestigious universities where she outlined her vision for royal family modernization within democratic frameworks. The lectures were carefully researched and constitutionally sophisticated, demonstrating her serious commitment to institutional improvement rather than personal aggrandizement. The first lecture, delivered at Oxford University's constitutional law faculty, drew an audience that included senior judges, constitutional experts, and political leaders from across the spectrum. Camilla's presentation was widely praised for its intellectual rigor and careful attention to democratic principles, while her specific proposals for expanded royal accountability received thoughtful consideration from legal scholars who had initially been skeptical of her campaign. Subsequent lectures at Cambridge, Edinburgh, and London School of Economics continued to build intellectual support for constitutional modernization while maintaining careful respect for democratic values and traditional monarchical principles. The academic reception was generally positive, with constitutional scholars noting that Camilla's proposals addressed real weaknesses in current royal governance while preserving the essential functions that made constitutional monarchy valuable. These lectures marked the transformation of Camilla's rebellion from a personal dispute with Charles into a serious constitutional reform movement with broad-based intellectual and political support. The rebellion had succeeded in changing the terms of debate about royal family governance, forcing even traditional monarchists to engage seriously with questions about accountability, transparency, and democratic evolution that had previously been considered off-limits. As spring arrived in 2026, the Royal Rebellion had fundamentally altered British constitutional discourse in ways that would have lasting consequences regardless of how the immediate crisis was resolved. The monarchy's relationship with democratic institutions had been permanently changed by the public debate about royal authority and accountability, creating new expectations for transparency and responsiveness that would affect all future royal family activities. The resolution of the royal constitutional crisis came not through dramatic confrontation or sudden capitulation, but through a carefully orchestrated process that took months to unfold and left neither side entirely satisfied with the outcome. By late spring of 2026, it had become clear to both Charles and Camilla that their public disagreement was causing more damage to the monarchy than either had anticipated, forcing them to seek a compromise that would preserve institutional stability while addressing legitimate concerns about modernization. The turning point came when polling data revealed that public support for the monarchy itself was beginning to decline as a result of the prolonged constitutional uncertainty. While individual approval ratings for both Charles and Camilla remained relatively stable, confidence in the institution of monarchy was showing concerning drops among key demographic groups. Republican sentiment, previously confined to small minorities, was growing among younger voters who saw the royal family's inability to resolve internal disputes as evidence of systemic dysfunction. More alarming for royal advisors was the international dimension of the crisis, as Commonwealth realm governments began expressing private concerns about the stability and coherence of the institution they shared with Britain. The Canadian government's discreet inquiry about contingency planning for potential royal succession complications sent shockwaves through the palace bureaucracy, while Australian Republican politicians used the crisis as evidence for their arguments about monarchical irrelevance in democratic societies. The first steps toward resolution came through intermediaries rather than direct negotiation between the principals. The Archbishop of Canterbury, working closely with the Privy Council, began facilitating discussions about possible frameworks for expanding royal family accountability while preserving constitutional stability. These conversations weren't formal mediation sessions, but rather theological and constitutional reflections on the balance between service and authority that had always defined successful monarchy. Simultaneously, Prince William began playing a more active role in seeking resolution, recognizing that prolonged uncertainty about royal family governance would complicate his own future reign. His interventions weren't partisan attempts to support either side, but rather careful efforts to find constitutional solutions that would serve long-term institutional interests. His unique position as heir apparent gave him authority to speak about future royal governance in ways that neither current protagonist could match. The breakthrough came when Camilla privately acknowledged that her public campaign, while successful in raising important constitutional questions, had achieved its primary objective of forcing serious consideration of royal modernization. Rather than continuing to push for immediate implementation of her specific proposals, she expressed willingness to accept a structured process for constitutional review that would address modernization concerns while maintaining appropriate democratic oversight. Charles, meanwhile, recognized that his initial response to Camilla's activities had been too rigid and defensive. While his concerns about constitutional stability remained valid, he acknowledged that the monarchy did need mechanisms for careful evolution to remain relevant in changing democratic societies. His willingness to engage seriously with modernization proposals, provided they included appropriate safeguards and underwent thorough constitutional review, opened the door for serious negotiations. The formal resolution process began with the establishment of a Royal Constitutional Review Commission, jointly appointed by the Crown and Parliament, with a mandate to examine current royal family governance and recommend appropriate modernizations within democratic constitutional frameworks. The commission included constitutional lawyers, parliamentary representatives, Commonwealth experts, and religious leaders, ensuring that all major stakeholders had input into the review process. Camilla's agreement to participate in the commission process rather than continuing her public campaign represented a significant concession to institutional stability concerns. She would have opportunities to present her modernization proposals through proper constitutional channels, but she would no longer be appealing directly to public opinion or creating pressure for immediate change outside established democratic processes. This satisfied Charles's concerns about constitutional propriety while preserving Camilla's substantive goals. The Commission's 18-month mandate included comprehensive review of current royal family roles and responsibilities, analysis of successful constitutional monarchy evolution in other democratic societies, examination of public expectations for royal accountability and transparency, and development of specific recommendations for appropriate modernizations within British constitutional frameworks. The process would be thorough, democratic, and carefully designed to avoid the kind of uncertainty that had characterized the recent crisis. Personal reconciliation between Charles and Camilla proved more complex than institutional resolution. The constitutional crisis had revealed fundamental differences in their visions for monarchy's future that went beyond simple disagreement about roles and responsibilities. Their marriage had been tested by questions about authority, ambition, and service that touched the core of their relationship and their shared commitment to royal duty. The healing process began with private conversations facilitated by their mutual friend, the Duchess of Gloucester, who had observed similar tensions in previous royal generations and understood the personal costs of constitutional disagreement. These weren't formal counseling sessions, but rather informal discussions about the balance between personal ambition and institutional responsibility that had always challenged royal family members. Charles's acknowledgement that he had underestimated the legitimacy of Camilla's modernization concerns was matched by her recognition that her public campaign had created unnecessary institutional uncertainty. Both accepted responsibility for allowing their disagreement to escalate beyond what was appropriate for serving constitutional monarchy, and both committed to supporting whatever recommendations emerged from the formal review process. The royal family's public presentation during the resolution process was carefully managed to demonstrate unity while acknowledging legitimate differences about constitutional development. Joint appearances emphasized their shared commitment to royal service and democratic values, while separate activities allowed each to pursue their individual contributions to royal duties without creating appearance of ongoing conflict. Public opinion responded positively to the establishment of the formal review process, with majorities expressing approval for systematic constitutional examination rather than ad hoc changes driven by immediate political pressures. The Commission's membership was generally well received, and its mandate was seen as appropriately comprehensive while maintaining democratic oversight of potential royal governance changes. Media coverage of the resolution phase was notably more positive than the crisis period reporting, with commentators praising both Charles and Camilla for their willingness to prioritize institutional interests over personal preferences. The establishment of formal constitutional review was seen as evidence of the monarchy's ability to adapt to democratic expectations while maintaining essential stability and continuity. International reactions were similarly positive, with Commonwealth realm governments expressing satisfaction that constitutional uncertainties were being addressed through proper democratic channels. European constitutional monarchies privately expressed approval for Britain's systematic approach to royal modernization, while Republican movements found it difficult to maintain criticism of monarchical institutions that demonstrated such responsiveness to democratic oversight. The Commission's preliminary work suggested that significant constitutional modernization was indeed possible within existing democratic frameworks, but that such changes required careful implementation to avoid unintended consequences. Early findings indicated public support for expanded royal accountability and transparency, but also strong preference for maintaining clear boundaries between royal service and political authority. Specific areas identified for potential reform included expanded royal family reporting about charitable activities and public engagements, increased parliamentary oversight of royal household finances, clearer protocols for royal family involvement in policy discussions, and enhanced accountability measures for expanded royal authorities. These changes would address many of Camilla's original concerns while maintaining the constitutional safeguards that Charles had insisted upon. The personal cost of the constitutional crisis extended beyond Charles and Camilla to affect the entire royal family's approach to public service and internal relationships. The experience had demonstrated how quickly private disagreements could escalate into public constitutional crises, creating new awareness of the need for careful consideration of institutional implications in all royal family decisions. Prince William's preparation for eventual kingship was profoundly influenced by observing how constitutional disagreements could threaten institutional stability. His own approach to royal modernization would be shaped by lessons learned from the crisis, particularly the importance of building broad consensus before implementing significant changes and the need for clear communication about the democratic principles underlying royal service. The broader British political system also evolved as a result of the crisis, with enhanced parliamentary interest in royal governance and constitutional development. The tradition of respectful distance between elected representatives and royal family internal matters remained intact, but there was new recognition that constitutional monarchy required ongoing democratic oversight to maintain legitimacy in contemporary society. As 2026 drew to a close, the immediate crisis had been resolved through institutional processes that strengthened rather than weakened constitutional monarchy. The Royal Constitutional Review Commission's work continued, promising careful examination of royal modernization possibilities within democratic frameworks. Both Charles and Camilla had emerged from the crisis with enhanced understanding of their roles and responsibilities, while the monarchy itself had demonstrated its ability to evolve thoughtfully in response to legitimate constitutional concerns. The ultimate legacy of Camilla's failed power play wasn't the immediate expansion of royal authority she had originally sought, but rather the establishment of democratic processes for constitutional evolution that would serve the monarchy for generations to come. Her rebellion had forced necessary conversations about royal accountability and modernization, while Charles's insistence on constitutional propriety had ensured that changes would occur through appropriate democratic channels rather than unilateral royal action. The royal family had survived its greatest internal crisis in decades by ultimately choosing institutional stability over individual ambition, democratic process over personal preference, and careful evolution over dramatic revolution. The monarchy emerged stronger and more democratically legitimate, prepared to face future challenges with enhanced constitutional frameworks and renewed public confidence in its ability to serve contemporary British society while preserving essential traditions and values.